Hey there, my teacher friends. Do you have students that are dealing with trauma? Or maybe they're just really stressed out? How about you? How are you doing, my friend? We are all feeling a little stressed and worn and frayed at the edges right about now, aren't we? And that isn't just our normal teaching stuff, because that's part of it. But part of it is everything that's been going on in our world. And it's been exhausting. Isn't it time that we find a way to move forward with hope and joy and healing? Well, my guest today has coping skills and all kinds of things to help you and your students not just survive, but thrive. And isn't that what we really want? Well, my guest today is here to show you how. Let's get started. Today's episode is sponsored by everyteachereveryday.org. Teachers, I know you're juggling a lot of plates this year. Every Teacher Every Day wants to make the juggling smoother for teachers with its new website available at zero cost. With a searchable database of free lesson plans and resources, Every Teacher Every Day provides a diverse community of wise and witty educators to engage with. I love the idea behind this website. It's easy to use and effective, and it's my favorite teacher price, free. You can join the community now by going to everyteachereveryday.org/teach joyfully. I'm Lisa Burns, a teacher success coach, veteran elementary teacher, and mom of 5. And this is the Teach Joyfully podcast. Thanks for joining me today. Let's dive in.
I have a special guest today on the podcast. His name is Dr. Michael Gaskell. He has been a special educator and assistant principal and is currently a middle school principal in New Jersey. In addition, he mentors new principals to the New Jersey leaders. He is an award-winning author, speaker, and including presenting just recently at the Learning and the Brain conference in this last November. He's known for supporting individual excellence and student success for all students. And Mike has graciously agreed to chat with me today about his new book, Leading Schools Through Trauma. And I have to tell you, I could not put this one down. You're going to love it. And it is a guide on how to help stressed out students and staff find their footing and move forward. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Lisa, it's a pleasure to join you. Thanks so much for having me on.
I am so excited to talk about this. I think that this is such an important topic right now. And not to say it hasn't always been an important topic, but now more than ever. Are we not more stressed out than ever with COVID?
Oh, it's multiplied.
Yeah,
It's exponential.
it is exponential. And it's not just students, it is our teachers and our staff too, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's a chapter in my book about self-care for educators. So, there's definitely a recognition from, both sides of the desk, so to speak. We have to take care of ourselves. It's that concept of, putting your oxygen mask on before you can put the oxygen mask on your child. And we need to have that philosophy because we need to give ourselves some credit, recognize that it is tough teaching in the current environment. We need to be honest and transparent about that. We can't begin to help kids or address the issues in schools today before we start there. Once we start there, we have a foundation we can start to build the bedrock around and jump off of.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I use that image all the time of putting your own oxygen mask off first.
Okay.
I think it really does speak a lot to teacher self-care. It's a really important thing. It's always been important, but I think now more than ever, we have teachers buying into the concept more fully that they need to care for themselves first, because we as teachers really do put ourselves last. And we don't always admit to ourselves we're doing it, but I think teachers are being more honest with themselves now about putting themselves first.
And that's the first step. I'm proud to see that my own teachers are doing that. And I get really concerned when I see that anxiety overwhelming them. This is a legitimate issue. It's okay to accept that we are imperfect, that we need to start addressing ourselves and acknowledging that we can't do this on our own. We have to do this together. We have to use some of the strategies that, we'll talk about today, both for kids and for ourselves, and that will help, again, give teachers the credit they deserve. This is one of the hardest jobs they'll love. It's kind of like as my wife will say delivering a child is, and then raising a child is one of the most hardest jobs that you'll love. And it's so same thing for education. It's very rewarding, but it's also very taxing.
Yes, for sure. It is. Okay. So at this point in time, I just want to say, who doesn't have students that are dealing with trauma these days? No one. I don't think there's a classroom in the country where there isn't some child, at least one, who's dealing with trauma right now. And as a principal and as a teacher, we have to look at that and say, how do we help these students? So many students and teachers are traumatized in varying degrees in varying ways, whether it's from COVID or whether it's from other things that are happening in the home or in their family or with other students or wherever it is. We have to recognize that even though maybe what we think is traumatizing is not traumatizing for someone else, we have to recognize that and at least admit it. So when we first spoke, you and I talked about something that my sister said about just taking care of yourself and admitting that there's a problem. So how do you start to begin to help students kind of admit that there's a problem in the first place?
Well, I outline a 3-step process in the book, and I think this 3-step process both initiates that recognition, and then it allows kids to start building from that, just like we talked about adults. So the first thing I talk about is starting with fun relationship building activities. And while you're doing that, considering their state of wellness. Now, this is very much like what you might think about at the beginning of a school year, icebreakers and things like that. But I want you to think about that, sort of injecting that in, because part of the problem we're dealing with is kids are coming in with different levels of anxiety and trauma at different times of the year and at different moments, much more unpredictably. So what you're saying is dead on. And when you start to do that, you start to build that level of trust. And that takes time and patience. We've got to cultivate that level of trust. Everything is about relationships. Everything is about relationships, both in education and in building that trust, especially with more traumatized kids. More traumatized kids are going to wrap themselves in a harder shell that's going to be hard to break through. So we need to be patient and recognize that that's happening to them as well. The second thing in the process is starting to really assess their progress, whether that's behaviorally or academic. And I know we're going to hit on both, but it's very important to recognize that if you give lots of formative, small assessments, and that almost sounds counter to the first thing, but I'm going to explain why in a minute, you're able to start to get a real handle on kids authentically. We start to target things with regard to students' specific either skill areas or possibly behavioral challenges, and begin to identify what's happening. Now, the reason I mentioned lots of small formative assessments is, and Jessica Leahy, who's pretty well known in the education field, especially for addressing failure with kids, shared an article in the Atlantic several years ago in which she referenced research that talked about the fact that lots of small formative assessments are great for kids. They actually learn much more progressively. Now, the reason that matters is once kids start to learn and master things, they start to feel better about themselves. Obviously, kids with trauma, or maybe not so obviously, but I'm going to say it, is that they're really struggling with self-confidence, with the ability to achieve, with the ability to accomplish anything. Their life is somewhat chaotic, at least in their head. So getting them outside of that and seeing some of these accomplishments works. And then the next step in this 3-step process is to challenge students to set goals just above their current ability level or comfort zone. You want them, I call this the 4% in the book. And you and I talked about this. You said 1%, I said 4%. We both said, what's the difference? The point is, we want them just outside of their comfort zone. We want them taking a step or two up a staircase, not all the way up and around so you can't see where that goal is. It's achievable, it's reachable, but it's outside their comfort zone. These progressive steps are the distinction that makes them, again, start to feel better. And they start to experience small wins. Small wins, there's a lot of research out there, mostly in the corporate field. So I pulled this into the book and talked a lot about it and the importance of it with psychology, with helping students be comfortable that with their own successes and recognizing those, tracking those, monitoring those. And again, I know we're going to talk a little bit about that with gamification and some other topics as well. So that's essentially that 3-step process.
Right. And it's that progress over perfection, right? We're just looking for that continued progress. It doesn't mean they're ever going to have perfection. I think so often we're like, we're not looking for mastery. I think we've focused on mastery so much, but the reality is what really is mastery, because there's always more to learn. And so the reality is we need to start talking about that progress. What is that progress, and what's doable progress? What's reachable milestones for these kids? Is that not what you're talking about?
Absolutely. I love the way you said that, because right away in my head, it's something I often say to people. And I call this remarkably imperfect progress. Now, think about that. We're always going to take a couple steps forward, and maybe we're going to take a step back. Maybe we're going to take 2 steps back, but then we're going to take 3 steps forward. And we all have to acknowledge that's how real progress and tremendous success happens anywhere you look at success, anywhere you examine it. And so when we get kids to recognize that it's okay to stumble a little bit. In fact, that's part of success is this sort of experimenting and tinkering and trying different things out. So when we're able to get them to see past that, that's when you start to get into really cool stuff like post-traumatic growth. And there's a lot out there about that I tune into in the book as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're not going to be able to talk about everything in that book because there is just too much in there, but we're trying to give you the highlights here. So, we talk about that 4% or 1% or whatever the percentage you're shooting for of progress and of being out of your comfort zone. And we talk about, that progress over perfection. When we think about that, we're also thinking about this idea that here you have these kids who have been so stressed out, and they're so just out of their comfort zone in every area of their life, because this stress or this trauma is just completely inhibited all of their thinking. It inhibits their cognitive skills. I mean, you talk about this in the book, of this idea of they have no resiliency. They cannot do anything. They really can't learn, can they?
No, it's actually stifling. And that's the thing so we have to start applying some strategies. I think what's really important for teachers to understand, because they hear, oh, strategies, here's another thing I have to do. I get it. I'm a principal, but I'm a teacher's principal. And so I want to make sure that teachers understand that when they're helping kids, they need to integrate it into their existing framework. They should not be this should not be an add-on. This should be something that already fits into an existing framework. So when I write a lot about that. I use examples like the 1-sentence intervention and the 2-minute intervention, which are very similar. The 1-sentence intervention is a really interesting concept because it's boom, and it's sustained, and it's long-term. So is the 2-minute intervention. There's some research out there and written work about the 2-minute intervention and applying that over 10 school days. Repeatedly, though, because again, remember, these are kids who have built a shell. So they're not going to respond to you the second or the third time. And you should never give up the second or third time. But a 2-minute intervention can happen right within an existing conference that you have. If you have a conferencing table you're bringing kids over to, or if you have a way that you get around your room and just spend a couple of minutes. And again, if that doesn't work, you go to the 1-sentence intervention. And the 1-sentence intervention is something as easy as a kid who may have some challenges and therefore is responding with some behavior comes into the classroom on time, and you say to them, and then they get noisy, by the way, right after they get in there, but they got in there on time. And you go over to them and you say to them, I really like the way you came into class on time today. Thank you. A lot of times by saying that first thing, you're going to start to eliminate that second behavior. And sometimes you may not be, but it's really important to remember that when you're greeting kids like that at the outset of a class, it's starting to set the tone about how you're going to reframe their mindset and give them a chance to do so. I just want to mention one really quick study related to this, and that's John Gottman studied. Now, I'm going to make the parallel here, so bear with me. He studied successful marriages versus divorces. And of course, we all pretty well know that 50% of marriages end in divorce. So you want to know what's working for the 50% that are doing this right, because that's a big gap. And what he found was that spouses were interchangeably giving each other 3 to 4 positives in terms of praise to every negative or constructive criticism. So when they were doing that, it was sort of turning the tide and making them feel better. And then when they did hear criticism, they were much more prepared and also trusting to hear it, because they knew that they were going to get a few more positives after that. Not necessarily consciously, but certainly subconsciously. There's a lot of work out there with PBIS, which is a national organization, positive behavior in schools, who talks about the positive to negative ratio and this importance that we can apply this right into the classroom. And we've seen a lot of success as a result in classrooms where teachers have applied this. Some teachers that are just great natural teachers do this instinctively anyway. But when we start to hear about this, most of us are very good teachers that may not tune into this. And if we do tune into it, we're suddenly shifting that balance and in response to child's behavior.
Absolutely. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it when you look at what happens in a marriage versus what happens in a classroom, because they're just relationships, and that's all it is. It's a relationship. And who wants to hear bad stuff all the time, right? But it's really easy to be, oh, go do this, and no, you need to do this, and directing, because that's what we do as teachers. But if we can take a step back and remember to be thankful and grateful and appreciative of all of the tiny little things, then when we do have a criticism, to say, boy, it's so much easier to hear, isn't it?
Yeah. And, kids that hear negatives all the time are used to that. So then they go to that because that's their way of getting attention. We need to reverse the script for them. And they're not used to that. They're used to hearing the negative thing. So they're going to test you the first few times for sure. But once you start to build that relationship, you've really etched it in deeply. And that's a trust factor for a kid who might be disadvantaged or who has challenges, traumatized, all of the above. These are kids that are used to being called out on their misbehavior or their inappropriate conduct or whatever. And once we start to point out the good things, and by the way, there are enough good things, you should never just create those things. They can be super small. Like I said, coming into the classroom on time, but then being too loud. Focus on the thing that was, positive in that, and then they will respond. And like I said, 3 to 4 to 1. I didn't say 15 to 1. There is a point of diminishing return. The researchers found you do not, now you're just fabricating stuff. And then they see that, kids see right through all that, don't they? So it's really important for us to be authentic with them and to give them praise they deserve, and to just watch that balance at about 3 to 5 to 1.
Well, and I think as my kids who played a lot of sports, very competitive sports, it's the participation trophy versus the one you actually earned, right?
Yeah.
And there isn't a kid in the world who appreciates the participation trophy, because it just says you showed up, right? All you did was you showed up today, right? You didn't do anything, you didn't earn this. It's just it's more for the parents, right? And
it's a
the
token.
reality is, yes, and the reality is, kids know what's authentic, and they demand authenticity. And you can see the difference in a relationship with a teacher who is very authentic with students and one who's not being authentic. And even that happens to all of us. We're not perfect. Sometimes we're not as authentic as we think we are being, and kids will see through it in a hot second, won't they?
They really will. And that honesty and sincerity is so important to building that foundation. We just have to look through that lens of, there is some good in this child. This is a child. And I know they're, and I can recognize those when I think of them consciously, and then make sure we point them out. Don't just hurry on to the next thing. Just 2 seconds, that's all it takes to say something like that. And that's that one sentence intervention concept.
Absolutely. And it can be very hard to change our mindset around a child sometimes too, especially if it's mid-year and we've had all this history with them. It can be very difficult to change our own mindset around a child. But like everything else that I say, when you're talking to someone and you're going to whether it's classroom management strategies or whatever it is, it can help to think back on the prior day and think, what is this child consistently doing right? And get yourself prepped for that. Write a few ideas down. That doesn't mean that will happen the next day, but you're kind of getting yourself in that mindset and you're getting ready for it so that it can help you maybe come out with the right kinds of things for that student the next day, because we move at 100 miles an hour in the classroom, and it's really easy to miss the good stuff, isn't it?
It really is. And by, sort of summoning some of this, by the way, you're explaining it, is exactly how we're able to really get this out. It starts to become more of a contagious kind of a behavior. And like we said earlier, it's not easy. It's not going to happen overnight. It takes patience, and it takes just hanging in there with this, especially with a child who's traumatized. They're going to take longer. It's part of that shell they've built around them. So if we just know we just need to kind of peck away at that shell, ever so subtly, we're going to be able to break it open. And once we do, you're really going to be able to get in there and help them.
Absolutely. Yes, that's right. That's right. Okay. So you mentioned, we talk about that 1% and that idea of these little quizzes. That's one of the strategies and stuff. And there's actually a book. It's called Make It Stick. It is the science of learning, and it goes into all the science of this. And frequent quizzes, short quizzes, is actually one of the strategies that's in there. But they spend a lot of time doing a lot of research on what works best to help learning make stick. And I know that you cited some other instances and studies too. And it's really true. There's lots of good strategies that help make learning stick, that help break through some of these other barriers that kids have built up. So let's get down and start talking about some of these strategies here.
Yeah, this is the fun part.
It is the fun part. So we've talked about, you have to build that relationship to break through cognitively for the students. And we've got to reframe our mindset so that we're thinking about incremental success. And then in your book, you talk about the idea of a compound effect of stacking strategy. So let's talk about that real quick, and then we'll get right into the strategy.
Okay, so it's this idea that when we stack things together, we increase the likelihood that not just one by itself, but two almost equals three, or two almost equals five. 2 + 2 = 5 is the essence of what I'm trying to say. And of course, mathematically, that doesn't make sense. My point is, you start to see this exponential growth, because when you add interventions together and try these little things in combination, kids don't necessarily know it. Sometimes they may, but it doesn't matter. The point is, you're applying these different things that you start to see this almost synergistic mathematical increase in the likelihood you're going to be able to help kids. So when you're just trying one thing as a standalone, it might work. And what if it doesn't? The other thing I want to mention about that is, if you try 5 or 6 things and 3 or 4 of them work, who cares if 2 or 3 of them don't work? Throw them out and focus on the 3 or 4 that do, and you now still got stacked interventions. So we can definitely hit on some of those.
Absolutely. Well, and that's just it. It's like investing, right? It's that compound effect, right? You're looking at, this one's working. I've got one in place. Okay, let's add another one in. You have to do them all at once to begin with. Maybe you try one, and if it starts to work, great. You're going to add in another one. Let's try this one with that one and start to move them together. If one's not working, throw it out, pick another one, right? You've got a whole toolbox of strategies here. So what is going to work for any given student or any given class may not work with another one, but you have all these options. And so now you have this full toolbox, and you can give it each one a try to see what will work for you and for your students. So let's talk about the strategies. So you talk about mindfulness rooms. So let's talk about that.
This is really cool. So this is an idea that if you can find any room in a school, and it can be a broom closet. Obviously, it needs to be a legal broom closet, but the idea is that you can find a corner in the school where you can really dress this up and develop some, infrastructurally, some really nice concepts in there, some soft music, some really positive statements on the wall that say, you got this. Even Michael Jordan failed how many times, and then he succeeded, or whoever the current athlete is that they're focusing on. And just all of these other things, you've got these really comfortable chairs in there, and it's a safe place. It's a safe place where kids can go, because they know that maybe some places in the school they don't feel so safe in, realistically or unrealistically. Perceptually, that's how they feel. So we have to deal with the perception. When we give them a safe haven, a place to go into, they're going to feel like they have an outlet. That's so important. Sometimes they don't even need that outlet, but if they know they have access to that, it's going to be very validating to them. And then they may tap into that, go into there, do some gaming exercises. There's all kinds of tools in this Zen Den, we call it, at our school, that just gets them into a great mindfulness state and really reframes their brain. Some of our kids who have some of the greatest challenges go in there, need that reframing. It might be 5 minutes, it might be 15 minutes, and then they're able to come out. By the way, we do have somebody that supervises the room, and you can get somebody on a duty to do this. And it's the idea that kids are having a place that they can go, just turn off go radio silent, turn off all the noise, and really be able to reframe themselves. We've all had to do this, and we certainly need to give kids a chance, and that's the way to do it.
And it's a place to regroup. Now, I know sometimes, like, as most of my listeners are in the elementary school space. So in an elementary school, a lot of times we have a space in our own classroom, and it could be a small grouping of chairs that faces a corner, and you've got some LED lights and a few little things, and everyone knows you don't bug anyone when they're over there. They're taking a minute and they just want to regroup and have a second, and then they'll come back and they can be with the class. And sometimes it needs to be outside of the classroom. And if you can provide that in your school, in addition to, and it's certainly in the middle school and high school arenas, I think it's really important. It is such a great way for kids to regroup and restart, because it's easy for the day to go really bad if you never get a chance to just take a breath.
Yeah, and I love the way you described that. Elementary teachers can create a physical barrier in their room, and visually that identifies for a kid a safe place. That's a powerful thing. And yeah, put on some soft lighting as well. There's so many things you can kind of dress up. You don't have to do all these things that I get into in the book, but you can certainly just do, again, stack 3 or 4 things into that room, and you've got a calm place for them. You can ask the kids, what do they like in there? And then start to offer those kinds of options, obviously within reason. But you'd certainly want to create a space for them, whether it's in a classroom or a private room in the school, that allows that outlet.
So let's talk about one of the next strategies, which is understanding the ABCs. What are the ABCs?
This is really cool because it actually roots itself in some of my own special ed background. I was a special education teacher, and there's a lot of rationale as to why I wrote this book, and some other parts to that too related to that. But the antecedent behavior consequence thing is this really easy concept to track. And we can do this to really start pre-identifying some behaviors, anticipating those, and then preventing kids from winding up in just a far down the path too late, so to speak, situation or circumstance. So antecedent is the things that tend to happen beforehand. And there's a place to record this and track it. And I use an example as a reference, but you could probably go right on Google or whatever and find one of these forms. Antecedent behavior consequence. So antecedents happening, what's happening before? What's the thing that's sort of starting to set the stage for this? Then there's the actual behavior that's been triggered by that antecedent. That behavior is the incident. That's the thing that we all tend to focus on because that's the thing that stands out to us. However, we also have to be very careful and mindful that there is this antecedent that happened beforehand, and then the consequence is the ultimate, obviously accountability piece. The kid got sent to the office, or they had to have a timeout, or you had to call their parents, or they got a detention, or whatever that consequence is. And when we start thinking more carefully about how we manage this and how we track it, we're able to identify those antecedents at the beginning. This is a much more proactive way of addressing behaviors that, when we can do this, we're actually eliminating a lot of disruptions that get us too busy and too taxed in our classrooms. So if we identify those antecedents, if the kid just needs to sit there and, I don't know, play with a stress ball, and your school doesn't allow that, maybe you need to rethink how that's allowed, or that a teacher doesn't want kids grabbing things. And if and it's not disrupting anybody else, and that's preventing the child from going off in a different direction that's bad, you're able to prevent that. And then again, obviously with the behavior, you need to be thinking about the consequence. Consequences should be much more thoughtful than just a punitive thing. Punishment generally doesn't work. There's tons of research that shows this. We're suspending kids still too much. I'm a principal saying this. And we need to think of other interventions, more proactive things to provide the kids so that they can focus on their future rather than their past.
So I think that part of this whole process, and the reason why you're trying to keep track and document this antecedent behavior and consequences, is that you're trying to help move a child more towards self-regulation as opposed to us regulating them. Is that not correct?
100%. We need kids to start recognizing. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because this ABC concept is something they should know about. It's not just something we're doing behind the veil. We need them to be aware that we're identifying this and then sharing this with them. That's the beginning stage of helping kids to begin to self-regulate their behavior, which anybody in education knows or will tell you is a lifelong skill. They have to begin to create these self-regulation skills that allow them to manage, because we all get anxious, we all get stressed, we all get taxed, and kids are no different. So we need to be able to give them the tools to manage that. And this is that beginning stage of that.
And that's really what all of these strategies is about ultimately. Now, at the beginning, there's some are more directed toward that than others. Some of them are just simply to help them kind of get along. But the reality is we want to move kids towards that being able to self-regulate. That's the ultimate goal, isn't it?
It is the ultimate goal, because when you give them the skills, and I talk about things like breathing exercises in the book and teaching them how to do that, because the breath they can take with them anywhere, and they don't need to go to see somebody or get something to do that. And breathing exercises have a powerful, quick impact. And if we know how to teach them how to do that properly, they can do it. I was driving my daughter to cheer the other day and she was breathing differently. And I said, what are you doing? And she said, I'm doing the 4-7-8 method you taught me. And I said, does it work? And she said, yes, I feel much less anxious when I do it. And I said, yes, success. I did it right. And the reason for that is when you're doing something like breathing in for 4 seconds, holding it for 7, and then breathing out for 8, you're actually moving your diaphragm around in a way that's very much like a massage. It's very therapeutic. This is an internal sensation that gets kids calmed and relaxed. So that's just one example of the self-regulation skills we can teach kids as young as, I would suggest, 7 or 8 years old to be able to use.
Well, and I even think you can do that in kindergarten. There's no reason why young kids can't do that. And giving them strategies, I look at it as self-care. I talk to kids about self-care all the time, and this is a way that you can take care of you. And that's empowering. That's empowering. And they may not think of it that way at first. They may think it's dumb or it's stupid or I want to do this. But once they start realizing how much control it gives them, boy, is it powerful. Let's get another strategy in here. Go ahead.
So another strategy that I would suggest is something very easy to employ in a classroom, because most kids come to classrooms today with a device that's issued by the school, or a device they're allowed to bring, and or their cell phone, right? Even kids that are younger in elementary school have a device, some sort of access, whether it's an iPad, a Chromebook, or a cell phone, or any of the above. And a really good tool is to do something called, what I like to call, coffee talk. And the idea behind this is, if you've ever been in a Starbucks or any kind of a coffee house, you'll notice that people tend to sit in there with like laptops, and they might have their, honed into their work, or they've got papers all over. And we might have even done that ourselves and realized, wow, when I went into a coffee house, I was really in the zone. And there's actually scientific evidence about why. And then we can translate that in the classroom. The idea is this: when you're in a coffee house, there's this indistinguishable chatter in the background. And that's what I like to call distracted focus. It's enough of a distraction away from other exterior things like your cell phone and, intense conversations and whatever else is going on in the world, the terrible news of the day, that you're not paying attention to any of that. And yet it's at this 6 to 8 megahertz level, which I know sounds really geeky, but the idea behind that is it's this perfect melodic state that's hitting both sides of your brain, that is allowing you to really focus on your task. And then you jump into this state called deep work, and you start doing work deeply and focused. And what's great about that is deep work in and of itself. So the coffee talk gets you focused and calm, and then the deep work gets you feeling great and accomplished. And again, we talked earlier about how students who are traumatized do not feel accomplished. They feel like they can't achieve anything. So when we give them a device to do that, it works. So the simple idea here is you let them go on YouTube and listen to coffee house chatter. There's things on there for 10 hours, an hour. I don't know who's working for 10 hours, but certainly an hour or two and there's plenty of those out there. And you have them pop in some cheap headphones, and they can listen and work independently, or you can play for the whole class while they're working on maybe projects or a learning centers kind of concept. And you can be, playing that for the whole ambiance, and it really gets people tuned in. By the way, it sounds a little weird at first. So it's important to listen to it for about 3 to 5 minutes. And then people kind of go, oh, I get it now. So that's the thing. So don't just listen to it for a minute or have your kids do it for a minute and say, this isn't working. Give it time. They'll love it.
So funny. Well, and you talk about, we're going to have a Starbucks moment, or we're going to have coffee talk. You can name it almost anything you want, but kids will understand that. I mean, it's part of our culture, isn't it? So
Sure
I
is.
think I think that's really cool. And kids, I think, would really love it. It's kind of an interesting concept when you frame it in that kind of a way. So cool. All right. And that's easy to do. I love easy because you're already working, right? All you're doing is you're playing this coffee talk chatter in the background. I mean, how easy is that? We talk about playing music and things like that, but sometimes music can be distracting depending on what you're playing. And so having this coffee talk chatter might be that happy medium. Okay, so let's talk about another strategy.
So another thing that might be more of a student's ability to, going back to self-regulation, is self-talk skills. And there's actually a couple of different ways to look at that. One is to just be helping them understand that, like, look, if you talk yourself through an issue, you can actually create a much more objective rather than subjective way of looking at it. And more significantly, there's a lot of research out there now about this thing called distanced self-talk. Now, this is the idea that you're talking about yourself in the third person. So let's say that, Lisa, felt like she was just crazy this morning. And everybody kind of looks at her and says, but you got everything done. Lisa then needs to say, as Lisa, I think that Lisa was overreacting to this circumstance. And if she sees the bigger picture, she was able to make dinner, she was able to get the kids fed, she was able to take care of the dog, and everything got accomplished today. And when you do this from a distance perspective, you're creating this much more objective mindset, and you're allowing your brain to say, hey, this is the person over here, and this is what's really happening.
Interesting, because I do think a lot of students who are dealing with any kind of trauma or stress very often cannot say good things about themselves. They can't frame it. It's just too hard because they're just stuck. And so I think this is a great way to get them unstuck, to be able to talk about themselves in the third person. And it's kind of like, how you think about royalty, they would, well, we, or they have the royal we, or however they talk about themselves. They talk about themselves not as, as King John, I'm talking about myself as some royal entity out there, right? And
That's right.
It's kind of that same thing, isn't it?
Yes.
I love that strategy. Okay, so we're going to run out of time, but let's go through a couple of strategies real quick here, and then we can wrap it up. And I'll put a few more in the show notes, and there's always the book, so we can absolutely put a link to that in the show notes as well. All right, so you talk about using mentorship. I'm going to give you a few. Mentorship. We talk about curiosity and the power of curiosity, of trust building, which we already talked about. And then you talked also about this idea of greeting students at the door, which I think in the elementary space absolutely happens already. But having that extra statement of noticing something, connecting with them. Oh, how did your soccer game go yesterday? Oh, whatever it is, but creating a connection in those moments, I think is really important. But I think in the middle school and high school space, that doesn't always happen, does it?
No. And what's really neat is there was this research study to see how this works in, upper elementary, middle school levels. And what was discovered was, and it was behavior challenged kids that they were specifically looking at. And all they wanted to know was, how was their engagement during class if we greeted them with a personalized greeting? So I like the way you said that. It wasn't just good morning, good morning, good morning. It goes, hey, I saw your game. Hey, you're going to have that party Thursday night. Good luck. Good luck with, that test on Wednesday. And you're individualizing this to each kid because, of course, teachers, by November or December know their kids, and they can do that. They can personalize it. And when you do this in this study with kids who had real identified as behavior challenged kids, they went from an engagement. All they did was change the greeting at the door. Nothing else about their instruction changed. They leaped from 45% engagement to 72%. Now that might, teachers are going to say, well, I want 100%. Of course you want 100%. But the whole concept in my book is you're never going to get 100%. What you want is growth. What you want is to see this trajectory move, as I said before, imperfectly upward. And be satisfied with, wouldn't anybody be happier with 72% more engagement than 45%? That's an improvement.
Absolutely. And, I think when you think about it, you think, well, this is one strategy, and how simple was it to employ? It was one of the easiest things that you could do in your whole day, because it's at the beginning of the day when you're fresh, so you're not stressed and exhausted already, hopefully. And you're already greeting kids. So all it takes is one more quick sentence, a couple of words to connect with that child. That's a really simple, fast strategy. And then knowing that you're going to stack another strategy in somewhere during the day, then you're going to get that exponential growth. So yes, maybe you jump to 72% with just that one strategy. And once you have it down, then you're going to add in another strategy, and you're going to inch that up a little bit more. I think that's the point, is we're not going to get 100% all the time, but you might have days when you do get 100% simply because you stacked enough strategies. And that's the goal, is to get as high as you can on any given day. And there's going to be good days and bad days, but who wouldn't who wouldn't want at least 72% engagement? I mean, how often, especially as kids get older, are kids distracted and not engaged in their learning?
Yeah, and I love that you drew back to stacking. So that 72% could be 80 after you throw in another strategy, could be 90 when you try 3 or 4 that have been time tested by you. And again, move these in and out. They may work one day great or one week great, and they may not work the next week great. So you're prepared with some of these other tools that we talk about.
So you mentioned some story therapy. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
This is really neat. So when a really well told story is communicated to students, or anybody for that matter, the same brain pathways in the person who's reliving that experience are matched in an MRI. You can see this to the person hearing the story. So living vicariously, literally through the story. So why do I mention story therapy? Well, story therapy is actually something that's pretty commonly used in effective therapy practices. But teachers are natural storytellers. Think about it. How many times have you shared stories? Whether you read a story straight from a text or you just shared a story about something really interesting that happened to you a couple years ago. We do both of those things, and they happen as a natural part of our instruction, like I mentioned before, something you're already integrating. So think wisely about those kinds of stories you might want to integrate. And if you have some flexibility in sharing that, you're going to be able to get motivating, inspiring stories and really compelling stories. You can find these right online if you're not sure yet, or if you're just a great storyteller, seize the moment, because you've seen that happen already. And kids are literally, you can see them almost disappearing into the experience when they do that. It's like watching a great movie and getting sucked in, right? And when kids are inspired and motivated by, often I talk about like Olympic athletes who overcame incredible odds and became these incredible athletes and things like that. The teachers that when they share, students can really connect to this and identify and say, oh my gosh, I can overcome some of the challenges that I go through, and really feel like that. Like I said, the same areas of the brain are lighting up in both the storyteller and the person receiving that information. And that's really powerful. So you're able to really get them to connect, to almost integrate with what you're doing.
And I think that's really powerful because we do tell stories all the time and we integrate that into our teaching because it illustrates a point. But sometimes maybe we can direct our story to not just illustrate our point in our teaching, but also inspire students to be able to realize that they're not stuck and get them out of sight of themselves and the idea that they can't accomplish anything, and get them into that mindset of maybe it is possible. Maybe I can do something. Maybe I have some worth and some value to add here, like this other person did. And so I think it's a really powerful strategy.
It's very strategic in that approach, right? If we're strategic in how we share that story, and you can practice that, right? Or like I said, if you're not feeling comfortable doing that, have someone that's maybe on a great YouTube video. TED Talks are a good example in the secondary level. Some of the other things that are available, many in abundance. But just think about the kinds of stories you're communicating so that when you're getting kids pointed in the right direction, it's a very thoughtful process.
Right. And it's just another strategy. And I know in the elementary space, there's such a wide variety of picture books now that address all kinds of struggles and topics and things like that. And we talk about having a diverse classroom library. And this is the perfect opportunity to really use that library to help students in very powerful ways and use them very, very specifically for these kinds of ways to help students move forward and to believe in themselves and to build that self-confidence. And the idea of just the possibilities is powerful.
And again, it's like you said, one more strategy. So you put these together, you start throwing 3 or 4 together, you see that compounding effect happen.
Absolutely. All right. And so you had a study. I'm sorry, tell me the study again.
It's the Emmy Werner Kauai study. So this is the idea that, this is really cool. So about 800 kids on the island of Kauai were studied because it was a longitudinal study. And Emmy Werner and her team, what they did was they looked at these 800 kids, and of that group, they were able to identify a group of about 200 of these kids that were at risk, disadvantaged, traumatized, the whole gamut, right? And of that 200, a third of those kids were able to show the resilience, because this was a longitudinal study from the time they were little children and babies until they were 40. And they were able to, and these were kids who either had poverty, they had, they were adopted, they didn't, they were foster kids, they had crime in their family, just those kinds of identifiers that create this disadvantaged environment for them. Yet 1/3 of those at-risk kids that were identified were able to show that they'd become successful, resilient adults. And basically, there was a couple of really big things tied into that. One was something you mentioned earlier, which was broadly mentoring, which was this idea that they may not have had somebody in the home, but they had somebody in their life who they could affiliate with that was an adult that could be a positive role model, whether that was somebody that was a coach, a teacher, somebody that, an uncle, anybody that was related to them in a way that could make it, not related to them biologically, but could make a connection with them. And then the second idea behind this was a strong affiliation. That might be a team, that might be a group that they identified with, that might be a church affiliation. So there was these two main factors. And then, of course, there was some other things wrapped around this. And this was really the foundation for some of the ideas and strategies that sprung up through the years for this book. So the book was concluded sometime, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s. I think it was the late 80s. And Emmy Winter found this remarkable resilience among this group of kids. And they really just want to know why. It was kind of a cool case study because it was isolated on this island that people don't travel much to and from. And so it was almost like a control to be able to test that group there and identify what was happening. And so we got some really neat ideas as a result about how to address things like our current issues with trauma, just from some of the roots of studies like hers.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting because when you think about it, resiliency is really that coming out of trauma and becoming, stronger and better as opposed to broken. And that's always our goal. Yes, we want kids to learn to self-regulate, but we also want them to be strong and resilient. And we talk about resiliency. Yes, it's having someone who's in your corner, right? And is in your corner. And that's really an important piece. And then when you say, having a group, it's almost like a little bit of a family feel. There's somewhere that is a strong association, whether it is in your church or it's a team or something like that. It really is almost that sense of a belonging that some of these kids don't necessarily have.
Yeah, and that ties into this idea of post-traumatic growth, right? And in fact, there was I'll tell you one more really quick study that's neat. Google did a study of its employees, and they wanted to find out who the most successful employees were in this amazing organization, Google, were. And what was striking was they were expecting to find, Ivy League grads and things like that. They were not the most successful. The most successful in their organization were those that had been through a traumatic experience earlier in life and grew past it. That's that resilience piece tied into post-traumatic growth again. So there is this other side of trauma that shows us that we can actually not only be successful, but rather exceptionally if we set the right framework, do things like the things we talked about today, and they're in the book, and really allow kids the opportunity to excel after some patient, strategic, thoughtful ways of integrating things into our classroom practice.
And I think that's a really powerful idea because I think it's very easy to look at children who are struggling or have a really horrible time at home or have had something really bad happen and or just they're traumatized in their own ways that we don't necessarily understand. And maybe we wouldn't consider it trauma, but for them it is trauma, right? But we look at them as broken. And they're not broken.
No.
They're growing. And we need to look at them as growing, that this is an opportunity for them to grow, not to look at them with pity, but to look at them as, okay, so what are you going to do with this? And I think we talked about something that one of my sisters had told her daughter when she was in third grade. It was an incident that happened in school with some friends, and she was very sad and upset. And after listening and sympathizing to my niece, and my sister said, okay, you can have one day for your pity party. No one else will be attending, but I'll be happy to make cupcakes for you.
Absolutely.
And then starting tomorrow, you need to make a conscious decision about who you want to be and how you're going to move forward from here. And that doesn't mean you can't be sad. And it doesn't mean that you can't be angry or upset or anything else that you're feeling. You can still be all those things, but you need to make a conscious decision about where you're going from here. And if you don't, The world will decide for you. And it was such great advice. I have pulled that out so many times, even for myself, and said, okay, who am I going to be from this point on? Because that's really what we're telling these kids. You know, we're giving them these strategies and we're working with them and all this, but we're saying, okay, yes, you've had bad things, but who are you going to be and how are you going to move forward? Because that's the goal, isn't it? To move forward.
And that's such an empowering, liberating option. Let's set the groundwork for it. Let's open the door and give kids that chance, because we'll be surprised at how many will seize that once they believe it. And that believability is that trust factor. Once they get that, there's amazing things that can be accomplished. And that's the really exciting part of all this.
It is, absolutely. Well, I highly, highly, highly recommend your book. If you have not gone out and run out and get this, I will make sure I have that link in the show notes. Be sure you check it out. It is really worth reading. It will give you a whole host of strategies and ways that you can help students. And we all have students that need some help. And wouldn't it be great that that student could come back 5-10 years later and show you how amazing they're doing? Because that's what we're looking for, isn't it?
That's what it's all about.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I so enjoyed learning about all of this. I've learned a lot and certainly are going to be using all of it. So thank you very much for that.
It's been my pleasure.
Dr. Gaskell's book is called Leading Schools Through Trauma, and you can find that on Amazon and most major bookstores. In addition, I will put a link to that in the show notes. You can find Dr. Gaskell at mikesmicrominute.com and on social media, which I'll link in the show notes as well. So that's it for this episode of the Teach Joyfully podcast, my teacher friends. We are out of time and I'm out of breath. My sincere thanks to Dr. Michael Gaskell, my listeners for tuning in, and for all those of you who have taken the time to post a review or DM me on Instagram with your feedback and topic requests. You can find the show notes and all the resources mentioned in the episode on my website at www.hopeineducation.com/podcast. And don't forget to grab the cheat sheet with all the strategies from Dr. Gaskell in the show notes as well. Also, you can continue the conversation online with me in my Facebook group, the Teach Joyfully podcast community, where elementary teachers can connect, get help, and encouragement for all kinds of education and parenting topics. And remember, a happy teacher is a good teacher. Until next time, teach joyfully and take care of you.